All right, buckle up for a deep dive into something truly spooky and maybe even a little unsettling.
Oh, I love spooky and unsettling.
We're talking Ouija boards today.
Classic.
You guys send in some personal stories, and honestly, they're hard to shake off.
I bet.
We're talking like unexplained phenomena,
Right.
things moving in ways they just shouldn't, and even some near-death experiences that'll leave you wondering about coincidence or maybe something more.
What fascinates me is that these stories, they're not just about ghosts or spirits, you know?
Right.
It's like they make you think about belief itself and how our minds can like totally play tricks on us.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole power of suggestion thing,
Yeah.
especially when you're dealing with the unknown.
Right, and like just reading through these stories, I was hooked and a little creeped out even before we started recording.
Yeah.
There's this one story about a claw mark that like appeared out of nowhere.
Whoa.
Another one where a Ouija board reveals someone's social security number. And then these near-death experiences that happened right after the board supposedly predicted them.
Spooky.
It's a lot to process.
Yeah, and you know what makes this even more interesting is that we often see these kinds of stories like cluster around objects or practices that have this strong cultural mystique, you know?
Yeah, totally.
Like Ouija boards, seances, that sort of thing.
For sure. Okay, so let's unpack this. The first story comes from the person who sent in all this material.
Okay.
And they take us back to their childhood. Like 9 years old, an old Ouija board tucked away in a closet, classic setup, right?
Totally. And that
Yeah.
right there speaks to how these objects become like embedded in our minds. Even the way it's described, hidden away, almost forbidden. It just makes it more alluring. Like you're tapping into something secret and maybe dangerous.
Right, for sure. So they convince their older brother to try it out.
Right.
At first, it's all a bit of a joke. The brother's faking it, moving the planchette around.
Mm-hmm.
But then they decide to get serious, set the mood with candles, dim lights, make it spooky.
Gotta set the mood.
Yeah.
And that shift from playful skepticism to like actually trying to believe, I think that's really important.
Yeah.
Think about it, darkness. It just naturally makes your other senses stronger.
Right.
You're more aware of sounds movements,
Yeah.
even like tiny changes in temperature. It's like you're primed for something out of the ordinary.
It's like we're almost setting ourselves up to see and hear things that maybe aren't even there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Our brains are like pattern-seeking machines, always trying to make sense of the world.
Yeah.
And in a situation like this, where you're already expecting something unusual,
Right.
it's easy to see how you might interpret random events as like significant or even supernatural.
So in the story, they dim the lights, light the candles, and things start to get weird.
Here we go.
The planchette starts spelling out words seemingly on its own.
And that's where the ideomotor effect comes in.
Ideomotor effect.
Yeah, it's this psychological phenomenon where our subconscious thoughts or beliefs can actually influence our muscle movements without us even realizing it.
So like even if you think you're not moving the planchette, your subconscious beliefs about what the board's supposed to do could be like guiding your hand.
Exactly. It's like our brains are playing tricks on us, making us think something external is controlling the planchette, when it's really us all along.
Whoa, that's trippy.
It is. And when you add in like the heightened suggestibility of a dark room and that shared belief that the board is a conduit to spirits, it's easy to see how things can escalate quickly.
Things definitely escalate in this story. The planchette spells out yes to their first question,
Okay.
and then a very clear no when they ask if the spirit's good.
No.
Now think about the psychology of that moment.
Right.
You're in a dark room, senses are heightened, and you've just gotten a message suggesting you're talking to something potentially bad.
Yeah.
Heart rate increases, breathing gets shallow, fight or flight kicks in.
It's like your body's prepping you for danger, even if the danger's only in your head.
Absolutely, and that physiological response can then feed back into the whole experience, making it even more intense and convincing. Suddenly, every little noise, every flicker of the candlelight becomes like full of meaning and menace.
Exactly.
And then in this story, something truly terrifying happens.
What?
The older brother's left alone in the room for a moment, and he just lets out this scream.
Oh my gosh.
When the younger sibling rushes back in, they find their brother clutching his side with this fresh claw mark etched into his skin.
A claw mark.
This detail, the physical mark, it's so powerful
Yeah.
because it seems to offer like concrete evidence of something supernatural.
I know, but again, there are psychological explanations that could be at play.
Wait, so you're saying the claw mark might not have been supernatural?
It's certainly possible in a state of extreme fear or panic, people can experience altered perceptions. even hallucinations.
Oh, wow.
It's not unheard of for someone to hurt themselves without even being fully aware of it.
Okay, so their mind could have been playing tricks on them, making them believe something was attacking them when it was really themselves. That's both fascinating and disturbing.
The human mind is capable of incredible things, both good and bad.
Yeah.
And in a situation like this where fear and suggestion are so strong,
Yeah.
the line between reality and perception can get really blurry.
So this child or experience was so intense that they swore off Ouija boards until their cousin's encounter with the doll, which, let me tell you, is another level of creepy.
The doll. Okay, bring on the dolls.
And this story takes us beyond just the power of suggestion and into the realm of like specific information being revealed, which is where the idea of a simple board game starts to feel truly unsettling.
Right.
So this time, it's a group of friends in a basement, classic horror movie setup.
Classic.
They're about to use a Ouija board, but before they start, they move this porcelain doll to another room.
Interesting. Almost like they knew subconsciously that some objects are just inherently creepy.
Yeah.
Like we're hardwired to be a little wary of dolls, right?
Totally. Like dolls are creepy enough without adding a Ouija board into the mix.
Right. And that pre-existing unease is important. It sets the tone. Everyone's on edge looking for connections and meanings that might not otherwise be there.
So they start the session, and at first the board seems like it's not cooperating, giving nonsensical answers, nothing that seems to make sense.
Okay.
But when the cousin comes back from a break, the board has spelled out his social security number.
The social security number.
How could the board possibly know that kind of personal information?
That's the question, isn't it? Was it like gleaned from the ether, or is there a more rational, less spooky explanation?
Yeah.
Remember we talked about the brain's ability to absorb information subconsciously.
Yeah, like how we might overhear a conversation or glimpse a document without even realizing it.
Exactly. It's entirely possible that the cousin had seen his social security number at some point, maybe on a form or a piece of mail.
Right.
And that information got stored away in his subconscious.
So you're saying the board didn't actually know his social security number, but rather his subconscious mind was like projecting that information onto the board.
That's a very plausible explanation.
Wow.
Our minds are constantly taking in information, filtering it, storing it away, even when we're not consciously aware of it.
Right.
And under certain conditions, like a heightened emotional state or a suggestive environment, the subconscious information can come to the surface.
That makes sense, but it's still pretty freaky to think about, like, what if our subconscious minds know more than we realize?
It's definitely something to consider. And this story takes it even further because after seeing the social security number, the group challenges the board to prove itself.
Oh.
And the board responds with one word, doll.
Oh no, not the doll. I already feel the chills coming back.
This is where the storytelling gets masterful. Remember, they moved the doll out of the room before they started.
Yeah.
So this seemingly random word suddenly creates a connection. Like the board's not only aware of its surroundings, but also maybe influencing them.
Okay, now this is where I start to get a little creeped out myself, because the final reveal in this story, the doll, which was previously face down, is now standing upright, staring at them.
And that image, the doll standing upright, it's a classic horror trope for a reason. It taps into our primal fear of inanimate objects coming to life, especially ones that look like humans.
It's like that uncanny valley effect. The closer something gets to being human-like but isn't quite there, the more unsettling it becomes.
Exactly. And in this context, where the board has already seemingly revealed personal information and alluded to the doll, the sight of it standing upright is enough to scare anyone.
Needless to say, they burned the board that night. But like with so many of these stories, the fear lingers.
And that's a key takeaway here. Even if we can explain these events rationally, the emotional impact is real. The fear, the unease, the sense that something's just not right. Those feelings can stay with us long after the event.
It's like our brains are wired to err on the side of caution when it comes to the unknown.
Yeah.
Better to be safe than sorry, right?
Precisely. And these stories tap into that primal instinct, that deep-seated fear of things we can't explain or control.
So, 2 stories in, and we've already got unexplained phenomena, objects moving in seemingly impossible ways, and a healthy dose of psychological intrigue. But buckle up, because the next story brings us face to face with the question of fate and whether a Ouija board can actually predict someone's death.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
This is getting intense.
I am, right?
This next story, it really ups the ante.
Oh.
Like it goes from creepy things happening to like our core fear mortality.
Yeah.
The narrator tells us about a friend who decided to ask the Ouija board the ultimate question.
Ooh, what's that?
When will I die?
I don't think I could ever ask that.
Yeah.
Even if I didn't believe in the supernatural, it just feels like tempting fate.
It's like that superstition about saying Macbeth in a theater.
Yeah.
Some things are just better left unsaid, even if it's just for peace of mind.
Yeah.
But this friend went there, and the answer the board gave sent chills down everyone's spine.
What did it say?
Tomorrow.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
I would be freaking out.
Imagine the weight of that prediction. Even for the most skeptical person, that kind of answer it just plants a seed of doubt.
Yeah.
You start noticing every little thing,
Right.
every close call, every weird coincidence.
And that's exactly what happens in the story, right?
Yeah, the next day, the friend experiences not one but two near-fatal incidents.
2.
First, he's almost hit by a speeding car while chasing his dog.
Oh no.
And then a ceiling fan comes crashing down just inches from where he was standing.
That's terrifying.
Now, statistically speaking, these could be totally unrelated events, right? Accidents happen every day.
Yeah.
But the human mind is really good at finding patterns and making up stories, especially when we're primed to do so.
So even though the car accident and the falling ceiling fan might have just been random, the friend's mind, already on edge because of the Ouija board's prediction, connected them, turned them into like proof that the board was right.
Exactly. It's called confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias.
We tend to look for and interpret information that confirms our existing beliefs, even if those beliefs are irrational or unfounded.
So it's like we're looking for evidence to support the story we've already created in our minds.
Exactly. And in this case, the story is a terrifying one.
Yeah.
A Ouija board that can predict your death.
Right.
So every near miss, every close call just becomes more evidence that the board was right.
It makes you wonder if maybe that fear, that constant state of worry actually puts us in more danger. Like if you're so worried about something bad happening, you're more likely to attract it even subconsciously.
That's a fascinating thought, and it touches on the idea of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Oh, yeah.
If you believe something strongly enough, it can affect your behavior and potentially your outcomes.
So even if the Ouija board didn't actually have any power, the friend's belief in its prediction could have like subtly influenced his actions, made him more likely to be in the wrong place at the wrong time.
It's certainly a possibility worth considering.
Yeah.
It highlights the complex connection between belief perception and reality.
Wow, this is getting deep.
I know, right?
So what about the friend? Did he ever touch a Ouija board again after those near-death experiences?
The story doesn't say, but I think it's safe to assume he probably stayed away from them after that.
Yeah.
Even if he couldn't completely shake the idea that the board was responsible, the psychological impact of those experiences would be enough to make anyone think twice.
Yeah, I can't imagine going through something like that and not being at least a little traumatized.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if maybe there's some truth to the idea that these boards can tap into something dangerous, something we don't fully understand.
It's a question that's been around for centuries. What lies beyond our perception? Are there forces at work that we can't see or measure? These are questions that science, philosophy, religion have all grappled with. And the answers, they're still out there.
Well, on that unsettling note, let's move on to the narrator's own solo encounter with the Ouija board,
Okay.
which takes place on a stormy night and involves a terrifying shadowed limb.
Ooh, a shadowed limb.
I'm already getting goosebumps.
This story takes us back to the narrator's own experience.
Yeah.
Adds a layer of vulnerability and intimacy to the narrative.
Yeah.
Their home alone storm raging outside, and they decide to try the board again.
Classic horror movie setup.
It is designed to evoke a sense of isolation and dread.
Yeah, you can practically hear the wind howling and the rain pounding against the windows.
The setting is so important here. The storm, the darkness, the isolation, it all makes you feel more vulnerable and heightens the sense of anticipation. It's like the perfect backdrop for a story that plays on our deepest fears.
And in this story, the fear comes in the form of a shadowed limb, seen just briefly during a flash of lightning reaching around the narrator's bedroom door.
Now, this is where the power of imagination comes in.
Okay.
Our brains are wired to fill in the gaps, to create a complete picture from just a little bit of information.
Right.
So in a moment of fear and uncertainty, a quick shadow, combined with the idea that something's there, can easily turn into something much scarier.
Like our minds are making the monster in the shadows based on our own fears and what we expect to see.
Exactly. And the fact that the narrator was alone in a dark room during a storm would only make those fears stronger and the experience more vivid and terrifying.
It's like our brains are working against us, turning shadows and sounds into threats, even when there might not be any real danger.
It's a survival mechanism, really.
Right.
In the wild, it's better to overestimate a threat than underestimate it.
Right.
But in a modern context, That same mechanism can sometimes lead to false alarms, seeing danger when there is none.
So the narrator sees this shadowed limb, the door slams shut, and they spend the rest of the night like paralyzed by fear.
Oh, wow.
And when morning comes, they find the Ouija board in the dining room, a place they don't remember putting it.
And that detail, the board being moved, it just adds another layer of mystery. It suggests that what happened that night wasn't just in the narrator's head, but that something or someone was actually there.
Okay, now that's just creepy. Even if you explain away the shadowed limb as a trick of the light or imagination, how do you explain the board being moved?
That's the question that sticks with you, isn't it?
It is.
And it speaks to how powerful these stories are. Even if we can rationally explain away most of the details, there's often one thing, one unexplained anomaly that keeps us hooked, that makes us wonder if maybe, just maybe, there's something more to it all.
It's like that one loose thread that unravels the whole fabric of our rational explanations.
Exactly. And that's what makes these stories so compelling.
Yeah.
They challenge us to confront the limits of our understanding, to accept that there are things in this world that we might never fully grasp.
Okay, so we've got 3 stories each, more unsettling than the last, unexplained phenomena, objects moving on their own, near-death experiences, and a terrifying shadowed limb. It's a lot to process.
It really is. And I think what's most fascinating about these stories is how they show the power of belief, the way our minds can shape our perceptions and experiences, and our constant human fascination with the unknown.
And even if we approach these stories with a healthy dose of skepticism, there's still something undeniably creepy about them, something that makes us question what we think we know.
Absolutely. And I think that's why these stories continue to resonate with us generation after generation. They tap into something primal, something that speaks to our deepest fears and our constant curiosity about the nature of reality.
So where do we go from here? How do we make sense of these seemingly inexplicable events with our understanding of the world?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
And it's a question that each listener will have to answer for themselves. But I think the first step is to acknowledge that our understanding of the world is always changing, that there's always more to learn, and that mystery is a crucial part of being human.
I love that. It's about embracing the unknown, questioning what we think we know, and being open to the possibility that there might be more to reality than we can see.
Exactly. And even if we never find all the answers to these questions, the journey itself is valuable. It keeps us curious, engaged, and connected to the wonder and mystery of the world around us.
Well said. And speaking of wonder and mystery, you mentioned earlier that these types of stories often pop up around objects or practices with a strong cultural mystique. I'd love to hear more about that. What is it about Ouija boards in particular that seems to attract these kinds of stories?
That's a great question, and it takes us into the realm of cultural anthropology and folklore.
Ooh.
Ouija boards have a long and fascinating history, going back to the late 19th century. And their connection to the supernatural has been there almost from the start.
So even before horror movies and pop culture got a hold of them, Ouija boards were already seen as a way to talk to the spirit world.
Exactly. In fact, they were originally marketed as a harmless parlor game.
Huh.
A way for families and friends to connect with loved ones who had passed on.
It's interesting how the board was first seen as a way to help people communicate, not necessarily with spirits, but just with each other.
Right. The original patent for the Ouija board didn't even mention spirits or anything supernatural.
Really?
It was just described as a talking board
Right.
that let people talk to each other without actually speaking out loud.
So how did it go from a talking board to a tool for talking to the dead?
Well, that change happened gradually fueled by a few things.
Like what?
First, there was the rise of spiritualism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Spiritualism?
Yeah, it was this religious movement that believed you could talk to the spirits of the dead, and they loved the Ouija board as a tool to make those connections.
So the Ouija board kind of got caught up in this bigger cultural movement that was already obsessed with the afterlife?
Exactly. And then there was the media's role.
Mm-hmm.
Newspapers and magazines started publishing these sensationalized stories about Ouija board sessions, often making the board seem like a dangerous portal to the spirit world.
It's like the media took this simple game and turned it into something mysterious and maybe even dangerous.
Precisely. And once that story was out there, it was hard to change people's minds.
So over time, the Ouija board went from a harmless talking board to a tool for communicating with spirits and eventually to a symbol of the occult and supernatural, all thanks to cultural trends and media hype.
It's a pretty good summary, and I think it's important to remember that historical context when we're talking about these personal stories.
Yeah.
The stories we've heard today, they're not just random events.
Yeah.
They're part of a bigger cultural story that's been going on for over 100 years.
It's like these stories are tapping into a collective unconscious, a shared fascination with the unknown that's been with us for generations.
Exactly. And whether we see these stories as proof of the supernatural or as examples of how powerful the human mind is, they give us a fascinating look into belief, perception, and the human need to understand the world.
All right, after all that, I think we need a moment to just sit and process all this information. But before we do, I want to remind our listeners that we'll be back after a short break to dive even deeper into this fascinating topic. We'll explore the cultural and historical context of Ouija boards, talk about some of the psychological stuff that might be happening, and leave you with a final thought-provoking question to think about. So stay tuned. Welcome back. I don't know about you, but my mind is still reeling from those stories. It's amazing how a simple object like a Ouija board can tap into so much fear and fascination.
It really is. And I think it speaks to our fundamental need to understand the world around us, to try to make sense of things that seem inexplicable or unsettling.
Right, like we crave order and logic, but then these stories come along and just throw everything into question.
Exactly. And that's where the real value of these conversations lies. I think not improving or disproving the supernatural, but in exploring the gray areas, the places where our knowledge breaks down.
Okay, so we've explored some pretty chilling personal accounts and touched on the psychological and cultural stuff that might be at play. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I'd love to hear your take on the historical context of Ouija boards. Where did these things come from, and how did they become so connected to the occult?
Well, it's a story that takes us back to the late 19th century, a time of massive change, both socially and technologically.
Okay.
The Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Science was making huge leaps forward, but there was still this deep fascination with the spiritual world.
So it was like this clash between the rational and irrational, the scientific and the supernatural.
Exactly. And the Ouija board came right out of that cultural mix. It was first sold as a harmless parlor game, a way for families and friends to connect with each other, and maybe even with loved ones who had passed on.
It's interesting how the board was originally seen as a way to make communication easier, not just with spirits, but with people in general.
Right. The original patent for the Ouija board, it didn't even mention spirits or the supernatural. It was just described as a talking board, a way for people to communicate without speaking out loud.
So how did it go from a talking board to something used for talking to the dead?
Well, that shift happened little by little, fueled by a few things.
Okay, what were they?
First, there was the whole spiritualism movement in the late 1800s and early 1900s.
Right, spiritualism.
Yeah, it was this religious movement that believed in communicating with the spirits of the dead. And they embraced the Ouija board as a tool for those communications.
So the Ouija board got caught up in this larger cultural wave that was already fascinated by the afterlife.
Exactly. And then there was the media.
Oh yeah, the media always loves a good story.
Right? Newspapers and magazines started publishing these sensationalized accounts of Ouija board sessions, often painting the board as this dangerous portal to the spirit world.
It's like they took this simple parlor game and turned it into this mysterious and potentially dangerous thing.
Precisely. And that image, once it was out there, it stuck.
So over time, the Ouija board went from being a harmless talking board to a way to contact spirits, and then eventually to a symbol of the occult and the supernatural, all thanks to cultural trends and media hype.
That's a pretty good summary. And it's really important to remember that historical context when we're thinking about these personal stories. The stories we've heard today, they're not just isolated incidents. They're part of a bigger cultural story that's been unfolding for over a century.
It's like these stories are connecting to something deeper, a shared fascination with the unknown that's been passed down through generations.
Exactly. And whether we interpret these stories as proof of the supernatural or as examples of the power of our own minds, they offer a fascinating glimpse into belief, perception, and the human need to make sense of the world around us.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Ouija boards, I want to leave our listeners with a question to consider. Could these stories be explained by natural phenomena, by tricks of the mind, or is there something more at play?
That's the question, isn't it?
It really is.
It's a question that has fascinated and puzzled people for centuries. And while we may never have a definitive answer, it's a question worth asking. It pushes us to think critically, to question our assumptions, and to stay open to the mysteries that surround us.
I like that. So much of life is about embracing the unknown and staying curious.
Exactly.
Well, we've reached the end of our deep dive. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the strange and spooky world of Ouija boards.
It's been a pleasure.
And remember, sometimes the most interesting discoveries are the ones that challenge our understanding of what we think we know. Until next time, stay curious.